The night had disappeared. The sky was an ocean of ink, thick and impenetrable. At first, no one noticed. The city lights burned bright, neon signs flickered, and people walked the streets, oblivious to the unnatural void overhead. But then, something changed. It started with a whisper, small murmurs spreading to the town like a creeping mist. "The moon isn't out tonight," someone said. "It should have risen by now." The realization sank in slowly, like a cold tide creeping up bare ankles. Elliot Graves, a local astronomer, was among the first to sound the alarm. He had been watching the sky through his telescope, waiting for the familiar pale glow to crest the horizon. But there was nothing. No waxing crescent, no full moon, just endless, unbroken blackness. He checked his watch. 9:32 p.m. The moon should have risen 47 minutes ago. He tried to reason through it. A dense layer of clouds? Some bizarre atmospheric phenomenon? Yet, the sky remained eerily clear, stars winking like distant eyes. The moon was simply gone. By midnight, people had gathered in the streets, staring upward with uneasy fascination. Some laughed nervously, brushing it off as a rare event. Others checked their phones for news updates, but there was nothing, just vague reports of an astronomical anomaly and speculation from scientists who had no real answers. Then, the animals started acting strange. Dogs whined and refused to go outside. Birds that should have been roosting fluttered restlessly, their shrill cries echoing through the darkness. The air itself felt wrong, thicker, heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on the world. Elliot turned on the news. Every station was covering the same thing. A global event. The moon had vanished worldwide. Not just obscured, not just hidden, vanished. Satellites showed nothing. Where the moon should have been, there was only a perfect black void, a deeper darkness than the surrounding space. Scientists speculated wildly. Some proposed a cosmic shift. Others suggested an optical illusion on an impossible scale. But one thing was certain. The moon wasn't coming back. The first night without the moon. As the hours dragged on, the effects became undeniable. The tides were shifting erratically, ocean currents twisting in unpredictable ways. The gravitational pull had altered, subtly at first, then violently. Tsunami warnings blared across coastal cities. Fishermen reported strange, unnatural swells in the water. Then the power outages began. At first, they were scattered, just a few blocks at a time. But soon, entire cities plunged into darkness, like the world itself was unraveling. Generators failed. Emergency lines went dead. And then came the sounds. It started as a low, guttural hum, a frequency that made people's ears ring and their skin crawl. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. And beneath it, something else. A distant, shuddering breath. Elliot's stomach clenched. He stepped out onto his balcony, gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles went white. The street below was too quiet. The usual hum of the city, the cars, the distant sirens, the murmur of life, was gone. And then, far in the distance, he saw movement, a shadow where no shadow should be. Something was standing in the void where the moon should have been. Elliot's breath hitched in his throat. At first, he thought it was a trick of the eyes, some optical illusion caused by the unnatural darkness. But the longer he stared, the clearer it became. Something was standing where the moon should have been. It was impossible to gauge its size. Against the infinite void of the night sky, it had no clear form, only the suggestion of movement, a slow, deliberate shifting like a vast figure stepping forward through black water. It didn't glow, didn't reflect light, yet its presence was undeniable, a shape darker than the void itself. His body screamed at him to look away, to run inside and pretend he had never seen it. But he couldn't. He was trapped in its gaze, except it had no eyes. At least, none that he could see. The low, shuddering hum filled the air again, reverberating deep in his bones. The sound wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from inside his head. And then the city screamed. The first nightmare. The street below erupted into chaos. People poured out of their homes, their faces twisted in silent terror. Some clutched their heads, their mouths opening in wide, soundless wails. Others ran aimlessly, colliding into one another like broken marionettes. Elliot staggered back inside, slamming the balcony door shut. The noise didn't stop. It was inside him now, pulsing behind his eyes, scraping at the edges of his mind like a dull knife. His phone vibrated violently on the table. A call from Mara. He snatched it up. Mara. His own voice sounded distant, muffled, like he was speaking through water. Elliot. Her voice was sharp with panic. Tell me you see it. His stomach churned. You mean the thing in the sky? It's not just here. It's everywhere. His blood ran cold. What do you mean? Turn on the news. He fumbled for the remote, his fingers numb and shaking. The TV flickered to life, static hissing for a moment before the emergency broadcast took over. A news anchor sat rigid at the desk, his face pale and glistening with sweat. His lips moved, but his voice was lagging, distorted. The words slurred together, as if something was pressing down on the broadcast itself. Behind him, the screen displayed satellite footage. Elliot's heart stopped. The image was identical across every feed, every country, every city. The sky was empty where the moon should have been, and in its place, the same shape, the same shifting darkness. And then, without warning, the feed cut out. The second night, without the moon, the world plunged into silence. Elliot didn't remember falling asleep, but when he woke, the air was wrong. The familiar sounds of the city, horns, distant voices, the constant hum of existence, were gone. No sirens, no cars. Even the wind had died. A terrible realization crept over him. The city wasn't asleep. The city was waiting. Slowly, he approached the window. His breath fogged against the glass. The streets below were lined with motionless figures. They weren't standing. They weren't sitting. They were simply there, frozen in unnatural positions, heads tilted, limbs bent at strange angles. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead. A chill slithered down his spine. He recognized some of them. The old man from the coffee shop. The woman who jogged past his building every morning. People he had seen 100 times before, now nothing more than silent statues. Then, as if sensing his gaze, they moved, not all at once, not normally. One head snapped in his direction, then another, and another. Their bodies didn't turn, only their heads, twisting unnaturally on their necks to face him. His breath hitched. Then they smiled, a deep, slow grin that spread across their faces far too wide, stretching past the limits of human anatomy. His vision blurred, a wave of nausea rolling over him, and in his head, a voice whispered, "We see you." His body jolted, heart hammering. He stumbled back from the window, his pulse thudding in his ears. Then his phone rang. A single name flashed on the screen. Unknown caller. His fingers trembled as he answered. "Hello?" The line was silent for a long, suffocating moment. Then a breath. Slow, deep, wrong. And a voice. Asterisk, asterisk, not human, not earthly. Asterisk, asterisk spoke 3 words. "The moon is watching." The line went dead. Elliot's hands shook as he dropped the phone. His pulse thundered in his ears. He had to get out. He had to. A shadow passed over the window. Something was outside, and it wasn't alone. Elliot's breath came in short, shallow gasps. The shadow outside his window wasn't moving, but it was there, waiting. He pressed himself against the wall, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The figures in the street were still staring up at his apartment, their faces frozen in that grotesque, unnatural grin. Then something shifted. A man, no, a thing that looked like a man, stepped forward from the others. Its body jerked unnaturally, as if something inside was breaking and resetting with every movement. It lifted one trembling hand and pointed directly at him. A sound rose in Elliot's ears, low and droning, like a whisper buried beneath layers of static. His skin crawled, every nerve in his body screaming for him to run. Then the lights flickered. His apartment was drowning in darkness. He scrambled for his phone, fingers fumbling across the table. The screen lit up, casting a dim glow in the room. 4:33 a.m. And then another notification. Live broadcast, one viewer. A video link, sent from his own number. Elliot's stomach turned to ice. His hands shook as he tapped the notification. The screen loaded, showing a live feed of his own apartment. Something was filming him. He swallowed hard, his breath shaky. The angle was impossible. The camera was positioned in the corner of his ceiling, a place where no camera should exist. And in the video, he wasn't alone. A figure stood behind him in the doorway, tall, twisted, watching. His pulse slammed into overdrive. He spun around. Nothing was there. But when he turned back to the phone, the figure in the video was closer. And then the feed cut to black. The third night without the moon. The power didn't come back. Elliot spent the next few hours curled in the corner of his apartment, his back pressed against the wall. Every sound made him flinch. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were inside his head now. Soft voices, many voices, echoing from nowhere. We see you. The moon is watching. Join us. He wanted to scream. Instead, he forced himself to move. He needed to leave. Grabbing his backpack, he shoved in a flashlight, bottled water, his phone, and a small hunting knife he kept in the kitchen. It felt useless, but the weight of it in his pocket made him feel slightly less helpless. He reached for the doorknob, then stopped. Something was breathing on the other side. His fingers tightened around the knife. He held his breath, pressing his ear to the wood. Nothing. He exhaled slowly and turned the knob. The hallway was empty. He stepped out cautiously, the silence stretching unnaturally around him. Every apartment door was ajar. Shadows stretched long and thin against the walls, twisting in ways that didn't match the dim emergency lights flickering overhead. Then, a whisper, soft, right behind him. Elliot. He spun, but the hallway was still empty. His fingers clenched a knife. Get out. Now. The stairwell was his best option. The elevators were out, and he wasn't about to risk getting trapped. He crept forward, each step careful and silent. The closer he got to the stairs, the stronger the hum in his head became, like something waiting for him. The stairwell. He hesitated at the door. The handle was freezing cold. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open. The stairwell was pitch black. His flashlight flickered as he shined it downward, revealing the steps spiraling into an abyss. And then the sound came. A slow, deliberate knocking. Knock, knock, knock. It echoed from somewhere far below, deep and rhythmic. Elliot's pulse hammered in his throat. Someone, asterisk, asterisk, or something, asterisk, asterisk, was waiting in the dark. Then the knocking stopped. A new sound replaced it. Footsteps, coming up the stairs. Fast. He didn't think. He ran, charging down the steps two at a time. His breath came ragged and desperate. The footsteps behind him were getting louder, heavier, wrong. Whatever was chasing him wasn't running. It was moving faster than it should. He reached the bottom floor, shoving the door open. The cold air of the city hit him like a slap. And then he saw them. The streets were full of them. Hundreds of people, standing perfectly still, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, waiting. Elliot's stomach twisted. The sky above was black, no stars, no moon, but something moved in the darkness. The shape, the thing that had replaced the moon. It was closer, and then they turned. All at once, every single person in the street snapped their heads toward him, and they smiled. A voice whispered inside his head, "You should not have run." Elliot's legs gave out. The darkness swallowed him whole. Elliot's world dissolved into black. He wasn't unconscious, at least not in the way he understood it. He was aware but drifting, suspended in something thicker than air. It clung to his skin, pressing against him like an ocean of ink. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, but even that sound was being swallowed by the vast, suffocating silence. Then a voice. "You are awake." It wasn't spoken. It was placed directly into his mind, a weight that settled behind his eyes. Elliot's body stiffened. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. Something was here with him. Something vast. Something ancient. And it was waiting. The shape in the void. Elliot tried to move, but his limbs were wrong. He felt stretched, unraveling at the edges, his body melting into the darkness around him. Panic surged in his chest. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The voice returned. "You struggle. That is natural." The shadows around him shifted. A flicker of movement. Something impossibly large shifting in the abyss. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a suggestion of shape, a ripple in the darkness. Then, the shadows peeled away, revealing something that had no right to exist. It was not a body. It was an absence. A gaping, endless void that sucked the light from the air, twisting reality around it. And in that void, eyes. Not human, not singular. An ocean of them, opening and closing in slow, deliberate movements. Some were massive, the size of planets. Others were pinpricks, blinking in rapid succession like static. They all stared at him. "You look for the moon." The words pressed against his skull, warping in his mind. But the moon was never yours. The thing shifted again, its form spiraling outward. Elliot felt himself being pulled closer. The pressure against his skin intensified, like unseen hands pressing him from all sides. Memories flickered in his head, his childhood, his mother's voice, the sound of rain against his window. And then a new memory, one that wasn't his. A barren sky, a world without light. Something else had been here before. Something older than the moon, older than Earth itself. And it had returned. The city of echoes. The darkness fractured. Elliot was falling. His body slammed into something solid, the impact jarring through his bones. He gasped, blinking against a sudden rush of sensation. He was lying on cold stone, and around him, a city, not his city, not Earth. The buildings stretched into infinity, their shapes impossible, angled in ways that defied physics, twisting and folding into themselves like living structures. The streets were empty, but they weren't abandoned. Shapes moved in the distance, shifting through the ruins. Their forms flickered between existence and nothingness, their bodies half there, half elsewhere. They weren't people. They were echoes, and they were watching him. A sound rose in the air. Not words. A signal. A deep, resonating hum, vibrating through his bones. The city was awake. The doorway. Elliot staggered to his feet. The world swayed around him, the buildings pulsing like living things. He needed to move. Ahead, a structure stood apart from the rest. A towering archway, its surface covered in symbols that shifted when he looked at them. Somewhere, deep in his mind, he understood. This was a door, and it wasn't meant to be opened. The echoes in the streets began to move, gliding silently toward him. Their eyes, if they had eyes, burned with recognition. They had seen him before. They had been waiting. A whisper curled in his skull. Step through. His body obeyed before his mind could resist. As he reached the threshold, the city shuddered. The sky cracked open, and the thing that had replaced the moon stepped through. The city trembled beneath Elliot's feet. The sky peeled open, a wound torn into reality itself. And from that wound, it emerged, not as a shape, not as a thing, as absence. The void that had replaced the moon stepped forward, unfolding itself into existence. But it had never truly been outside of reality, only waiting behind it. The buildings of the impossible city buckled and twisted, their forms unraveling like thread pulled from a frayed seam. The echoes in the streets fell to their knees, their forms flickering, their mouths opening in silent devotion. Elliot couldn't move. The hum in his skull had grown into a deafening roar, a soundless command that rattled his very being. Step through. The archway loomed before him. Symbols shifted along its surface, burning into his mind, carving themselves into his memory like a forgotten truth resurfacing. This wasn't a door. It was a threshold, a way back, but not back to Earth. Back to the place Earth had been taken from. And then the thing in the sky spoke, not in words, not in language, in hunger. A force pressed against Elliot's chest, something vast and cold and endless. He felt his thoughts unraveling, his memories splitting apart like pages torn from a book. The moon was never ours. The truth slithered into his mind, filling in the cracks, making itself known. The moon had not simply disappeared. It had been reclaimed. A long time ago. Before Earth, before humanity, before even the concept of time itself. This world had not belonged to us. It had been borrowed. And now, the thing that had once kept the sky watched. And it had decided to take it back. The last choice. The echoes rose in the ground, their bodies shifting, moving toward him. Not with hostility. With purpose. They had made their choice. Now it was his turn. Elliot staggered forward. The archway's pull growing stronger. The symbols pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He could feel the truth bleeding into him. If he stepped through, he would understand. He would see what lay beyond. And he would never be human again. His hands trembled. The thing in the sky loomed closer, its presence folding over him like a second skin. He had seconds to decide. Stay, and let the world be swallowed by the thing that had once been its master. Or step through, and become part of what came next. The final step. Elliot took a breath. And then, he stepped forward. Reality broke. The sky shattered like glass. And the world, asterisk, the entire world, asterisk, was unmade. Epilogue. Somewhere, in a reality that was no longer ours, a new sky stretched across the horizon. There was no moon. There had never been one. And in the blackness above, something watched and waited for the next world to forget, for the next world to borrow, and for the cycle to begin again.